Olá, pessoal! Tudo bem com vocês? Sejam muito bem-vindos ao canal Inglês de Verdade. Hoje eu preparei algo especial. Um mini podcast feito para desafiar o seu listening e deixar o seu inglês ainda mais afiado. Você vai ouvir a história, prestar atenção aos detalhes e, no final, responder 5 perguntas para descobrir o quanto realmente entendeu. Dessa forma, você treina seu listening, expande seu vocabulário e ainda testa a sua compreensão, tudo de uma vez. Ah, e se quiser acompanhar com legenda em inglês, ela está disponível aqui no vídeo. Então ajeita o fone, se concentra e bora começar!
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're stepping completely off the map to wrestle with a mystery that has, well, it's defeated historians for centuries.
It really has.
We're diving deep into the story of a single, legendary city, Ubar, a place so elusive it has been discovered, lost, and then found again, 3 distinct times.
It sounds like pure fiction, doesn't it? Ubar, or as it's also known, Iram, has long been called the Atlantis of the desert.
The Atlantis of the desert, I love that.
And for generations, the only record we had of it was myth, just fragmented poems and stories. The consensus was that it was a magnificent legend, sure, but not a real place you could actually find.
A cautionary tale, maybe.
Exactly, a warning against hubris.
And the legend itself, it really speaks volumes about its power. They called it, quite dramatically, the City of 1,000 Pillars.
1,000 pillars.
That name, that promise of overwhelming grandeur is what kept people searching in one of the most desolate regions of the Arabian Peninsula for, literally thousands of years.
So our mission today is to unpack all of this incredible complexity. We're going to go beyond the myth to look at the economic reality of the city, the scientific breakthroughs that prove the myth were actually true.
And the relentless environmental forces that just keep swallowing it whole.
It's quite a story.
So let's start at the beginning. If you're going to build a legendary city in one of the most inhospitable deserts on Earth, you need a really, really good reason. Why was Ubar, say, between 3000 BC and 300 AD, such a global powerhouse?
Right. What made this impossible city possible?
Yeah.
It all came down to a single commodity. One thing that fueled the ancient world's obsession with ritual and with status.
And that was incense.
Incense. Ubar's entire civilization, its wealth, its political clout, it was all built on controlling the incense trade.
When we think of incense today, we think of a pleasant scent, maybe something for meditation. But in the peak era of Ubar's power, it was something entirely different, wasn't it?
Oh, completely different. It was strategic.
I've heard it was more valuable than gold.
In many markets, yes, it often was. The sources show just how central incense was to life and death in every major empire. It wasn't decorative, it was mandatory.
Mandatory, how so?
Well, the Egyptians needed massive quantities for mummification and rituals for their gods. The Greeks, the Romans, they used it in all their temple rites, public ceremonies. It was a required cost of doing business with the divine.
That makes perfect sense. If you control the supply of a required religious good, you control a massive amount of wealth.
Exactly. And we were talking specifically about frankincense and myrrh, which only grew in the southern region of Arabia.
So to get those resins to, say, Athens or Rome or Babylon, they had to cross hundreds of miles of the harshest desert on the planet.
And Ubar was the critical linchpin in that whole supply chain.
So Ubar wasn't just a marketplace, it was a logistics hub.
A monumental one. Just imagine the scene. These massive camel caravans loaded with precious resins, trekking for weeks through shifting sands.
They couldn't survive without reliable infrastructure.
No way. Ubar was designed to be the ultimate oasis, a huge fortress providing not just essential water, but shade, food, and crucially robust security.
Security against bandits who knew exactly how much that cargo was worth.
You got it. It was the first true high-security, high-value logistics facility in history.
That level of importance and wealth must have made its eventual collapse all the more dramatic.
It did. And this brings us to the first disappearance, the one that's embedded in legend.
Right.
For centuries, local stories claimed that Ubar became so wealthy, so arrogant, that it offended the gods, and the punishment was catastrophic.
Let me guess. It was swallowed by the earth.
The ground beneath the city suddenly failed, and Ubar was swallowed whole by the desert.
It's such a classic moral tale.
Yeah.
Pride comes before the fall. Archaeologists must have heard these stories for years, but they were just stories until the 1990s.
And this is where the past meets the future in the most incredible way.
I was waiting for this part.
That's right. The scientific confirmation of this myth in 1992 it's absolutely mind-blowing. A joint expedition was formed, combining traditional archaeology with really cutting-edge technology.
And this is where they brought in help from NASA.
Exactly. NASA, the space agency, searching for a sunken desert city.
What were they bringing to the table that, standard aerial photography couldn't?
They were using advanced radar and satellite imagery, stuff initially developed for mapping planetary surfaces like Mars.
So they weren't looking for ruins directly?
No, they were looking for patterns. Specifically, they were searching for the faint, compacted trails left by those ancient, heavy camel caravans.
Trails that had been buried by sand for centuries, but whose path had slightly compressed the earth beneath.
Precisely. From space, these faint lines all converge, like arrows pointing to a central hidden spot.
So the ground team just followed the line.
They did. And when they got there, they didn't find a city slowly being buried by sand. They found exactly what the legends described.
An enormous hole.
An enormous, circular chasm over 100 meters deep, just filled with ancient ruins.
Wow. So the mythical sinking was a real geological event.
It was. Geologists confirmed that the city had been built right on top of a colossal limestone cave system.
That seems unwise.
Well, for millennia, the city's people drew enormous amounts of water from that underground supply. Eventually, it weakened the entire bedrock until it just couldn't support the weight of the city of 1,000 pillars anymore.
So it wasn't an act of divine wrath.
It was a massive structural collapse triggered by resource depletion. The myth was validated by geology.
That's disappearance number one. Ubar collapses into a sinkhole, exactly like the legend said. The team found it using satellites they excavated. But here is the critical pivot in the story. They found it, but they couldn't hold it.
And this brings us to the second disappearance, where the environment itself proves to be a far more active enemy than anyone expected. The sheer struggle of working in that landscape is a testament to the desert's power.
The locals called the desert alive, right?
They did, and for very good reason.
So what were the challenges? I mean, it's sand. How fast can sand possibly move?
Astonishingly fast. The archaeologists' own notes detail the unbelievable frustration. They'd set up camp and work for, say, 3 months, exposing walls, mapping structures.
Making good progress.
Right. But then they'd return just a few weeks later, and the whole topography of the site had changed. Completely.
You don't just mean a few new sand drifts had formed.
No, much more than that. The sources describe seeing entire sections of exposed walls and solid-looking columns just gone, swallowed by new dunes that weren't there before.
How high are we talking?
We're talking dunes over 8 meters high. I mean, that's significant construction vanishing in a matter of weeks.
It sounds like a slow-motion battle against a natural force that just refuses to be uncovered.
That's exactly the analogy they used. They said the process felt like trying to dig inside water.
Dig inside water.
You move the material aside, and the desert just flows back in, erasing all your progress, even the ancient camel trails that led them to the site.
The ones they saw from space.
The very same. Even they appeared to have shifted their course, moving like dry rivers. So Ubar was found, but the relentless reburial by the moving sand was effectively an instant second disappearance.
Found, studied, and then immediately swallowed whole by the desert. But the story doesn't end there, does it?
Not yet. There was another attempt to consolidate and protect the ruins, which led to the third and maybe most violent setback in 1999.
So if the second disappearance was this slow, relentless pressure, the third was?
Sudden, explosive violence.
Tell us about this storm.
The team had returned. They were trying to shore up some of the remaining structures, but a massive sandstorm descended on the site. We're talking winds clocked at well over 120 kilometers per hour.
That's not just a dust cloud. That's environmental warfare.
It is. And the structures they had fought so hard to uncover were just completely exposed to that force.
And the result was?
Devastation. What the slow sand hadn't already buried, the storm simply dismantled. Towers were reduced to rubble. Entire sections of murals were just shredded by the abrasive sand. The whole excavation site was left completely unrecognizable.
It's the ultimate confirmation that Ubar is this. This enigma. It appears just long enough to tantalize us, to prove it was real, and then it retreats back into the landscape.
It really raises a profound question about history, doesn't it? How much of what we call lost is just actively resisting being found?
And this leads us to what is maybe the deepest insight from this whole cycle of discovery and loss, the modern theory that changes the entire way we define Ubar.
That's where the conceptual twist comes in.
Right, maybe the failure to hold on to the site stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of what the city even was in the first place.
For a long time, historians looked for one massive fixed capital, a desert Rome. But recent research suggests Ubar might never have been a single monumental city at all.
What do you mean by that?
The theory now is that Ubar was actually a network of rotating settlements.
A network.
Yes. Think of it less as a fixed capital and more as a dynamic system. These groups of people moved their primary hubs based on shifting trade needs, political factors, and most importantly, water availability.
A mobile civilization disguised as a fixed capital. That would explain why the ruins they found were so fragmented.
Exactly. And why they struggled to find the kind of monumental architecture you'd expect from a single city of 1,000 pillars.
So the name Ubar might not have referred to one dot on a map.
It may have referred to an entire geopolitical system, a whole region dedicated to the incense trade. The fixed ruin they found in the sinkhole was just one primary node in a much larger, scattered puzzle.
So if they only found that one settlement, they're only holding a tiny piece of the greater whole.
That's the belief. Researchers estimate that even after the 1992 discovery, 80% of what makes up the Ubar network is still buried out there.
Which means it's still an ongoing, active archaeological mystery.
It is. We may have only scratched at the surface of a much wider, decentralized civilization.
And it's just incredible that the initial discovery relied on space-age satellite tech to uncover those ancient, subtle trails, allowing us to find just one piece of this constantly moving puzzle. It's this amazing collision of the ultra-ancient and the ultra-modern.
It truly is. The story of Ubar is a reminder that history doesn't always conform to the neat, fixed points we like to draw on maps. It's defined by mythology, cutting-edge science, and the power of an environment that just refuses to let us hold on to the past.
It feels almost destined to be found and lost again, waiting for the technology that can finally hold the desert at bay.
Well, hope does remain high, particularly because of how it first disappeared.
The sinkhole.
Right. Since the city sank into that massive cave system, researchers believe some structures may have been protected from the sand and the storm.
So they could still be intact down there.
They could be, in those subterranean cavities, just waiting for future technology to reveal them safely.
The desert keeps fighting back. But human curiosity, driven by those ancient legends and now modern science, it persists. And this whole strange story leaves us with a provocative thought, something for you to mull over after this deep dive.
Indeed. If Ubar, the so-called lost city, was actually a moving concept, a network of life constantly adapting to its environment, we have to wonder.
What other great, supposedly fixed historical sites, the ones defined by their massive walls and singular locations, might actually be something much more flexible, more complex, and more widely scattered than we currently imagine?
It challenges us to look beyond the city limits on the map and truly consider the persistence of hidden history.
The deep dive continues. We'll see you next time.
E é isso, pessoal. Chegamos ao final do nosso mini podcast de hoje. Espero que você tenha curtido a experiência, aprendido novas palavras e, claro, desafiado seu listening de um jeito leve e divertido. Se você gostou, não esquece de deixar o like, comentar como você se saiu nas perguntas e compartilhar o vídeo com alguém que também está aprendendo inglês. Isso ajuda demais o canal a crescer. E lembre-se, quanto mais você pratica, mais natural o inglês fica no seu dia a dia. Nos vemos no próximo vídeo.
E se você assistiu até aqui e quer aprender inglês sem gastar um centavo durante todo o processo de aprendizagem, com acesso a ferramentas, atalhos e mentoria que vai fazer com que você absorva o inglês de forma rápida e natural, eu te convido a conhecer o método dos 9 passos para a fluência, onde você vai conhecer a forma correta de aprender o inglês.
Good. Now we can go in the water.
Com acesso a ferramentas que irão te auxiliar nesse aprendizado. E o melhor, todas encontradas de forma gratuita. E entre essas ferramentas, uma você usará para manter contato com nativos do inglês para que sua prática de conversação seja mais eficaz. Porque nada melhor do que absorver o inglês diretamente da fonte. E quando eu digo que essas ferramentas são gratuitas, eu não quero dizer que apenas o primeiro mês será grátis, como degustação, e que se você quiser continuar usando, você terá que pagar. Todas as ferramentas que serão apresentadas a você nesse método são gratuitas para o resto da vida, até quando você quiser usar. Esse método é perfeito para você que não tem ideia de como e por onde começar, e para você que já tem um conhecimento em inglês, mas ainda não conquistou a fluência. Nele você será apresentado a atalhos que vão acelerar seu aprendizado, que estudantes que estão começando não fazem ideia que existem. 99% das pessoas que colocarem esse método em prática, seguindo passo a passo, conseguirão realizar seu sonho de se tornar fluente em inglês. Então, se você acha que finalmente chegou a hora de realizar seu sonho e dominar de vez o inglês, clique no primeiro link da descrição, que eu tenho certeza que você não vai se arrepender.